Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
March 1945. After 9 months of bitter fighting, the Allies have driven the Germans across Europe to the Rhine River, the last natural barrier to the German heartland. It is here that Allied generals expect the battered remnants of Hitler's once proud army to mount their final defense of the fatherland.
Because the Germans had said the Rhine River is going to run red with American blood, and they meant it.
German reconnaissance planes take to the sky to pinpoint where the Allies will attack. Across the river from Dusseldorf, the view from the air reveals hundreds of American vehicles. Intercepted Allied radio transmissions confirm the presence of 2 American divisions. German observation posts hear them moving in across the river. All signs suggest the attack will come here. But the tanks spotted from the air are 93-pound inflatable dummies. The sounds come from loudspeakers. The radio transmissions from a script.
It's amazing the fakery that we were able to perpetrate upon the enemy.
A group of hand-picked soldiers waging a secret war of deception was now trying to pull off one last grand illusion, with thousands of American lives hanging in the balance, including their own.
Infantrymen would see us and realize what we were doing with these dummy tanks, setting ourselves up as targets. They'd say things like, "You guys are crazy."
Many of the men were artists who used paintbrush and pencil to chronicle their trek across war-torn Europe.
We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor.
Their wartime exploits remained classified for decades.
I used to refer to us as the Cecil B. DeMille Warriors.
These artists of deception were also known as the Ghost Army. In the fall of 1943, American GIs were pouring into Great Britain for the upcoming invasion of France. And a handful of U.S. Army planners in London was exploring how to use deception to give those soldiers an extra edge when they came face to face with the full fury of Hitler's Wehrmacht.
To win on the battlefield, you would like every advantage. One of the key advantages in warfare is surprise. Deception is intended to create surprise in the enemy.
One of the deception planners was Captain Ralph Ingersoll. Before the war, he was a controversial celebrity journalist. The New York Times once called him a prodigiously energetic egotist. In 1943, he was helping British intelligence mislead German generals planning the defense of Europe as to when and where the D-Day landings would take place. Inspired by British deception efforts, Ingersoll suggested that the U.S. Army create a phantom unit designed to fool the enemy right on the front lines. On Christmas Eve, 1943, a memo was sent from London to Washington requesting the creation of a top-secret field deception unit in time for the upcoming invasion. "I considered it one of my more improbable dreams," Ingersoll said later, "but damned if the Pentagon planners didn't buy it whole."
The mission was to try to be able to take 1,000 men and put them in so that 15,000 men could move somewhere else and not be detected.
We were going to be in show business where we set up one-night stands and, like ghosts, disappear.
Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower ordered that the new unit, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, be given the highest possible priority. Eisenhower believed that deception could prove to be one of his most potent weapons.
When people think of war, they think of the infantryman with the bayonet. They think of the tank, the artilleryman pulling the lanyard and the flash and roar of the cannon. But the essence of winning is the defeat of the enemy's plan and the imposition of your will upon the enemy. And to do that requires creativity and deception.
The 23rd would employ 3 types of deception to con the Germans: visual, sonic, and radio.
So it all added up. My God, there they are, the 35th and the 79th, or whatever, they're up there, and that's where it's going to be, right on, bang, on the map. Well, really, they were not there, they were down here.
To carry out visual deception, the Army selected a 350-man camouflage battalion, heavily loaded with artists.
We want somebody to tell us what something is going to look like from up in the air, and we're down here. We need artists who are pretty good at concept. They can imagine it, and they imagine it pretty well.
Before the war even began, the Army was on the lookout for artists. Army regulations emphasized the importance of enlisting the art world to create camouflage.
It actually says in that regulation, you will need to go out and get set designers, theater people, movie people, artists.
The Army drew heavily from New York and Philadelphia art schools to create the 603rd Camouflage Engineers.
And I had a right to this unit because I knew they were open. But you had a right to them and they had to accept you. It had nothing to do with the Army draft at all.
In early 1942, they began exploring the ins and outs of tricking the eye. One of their most ambitious projects was to camouflage the plant in Baltimore where B-26 bombers were made to protect against the possibility of German air raids.
Our outfit was responsible for disguising that and covering it. So from the air, it looked like it was the countryside.
In stolen moments and off hours, the artists in the unit painted and sketched. The 603rd became an incubator for young artists.
I did hundreds of drawings. And it's as though we weren't busy, but you have to realize no matter how busy a soldier is, there's always downtime. Soldiers are playing cards, they're shooting craps. And I drew. I just developed the habit, and I don't think it's ever left me.
I learned more about who I was as an artist and learning my craft by being there rather than even at school.
Fewer than half the soldiers in the 603rd were artists. The rest came from all walks of life. One art student from Brooklyn, Jack Macy, was so dazzled by the diversity of the men in his company, he set out to caricature every one of them.
They were either cops, they were shoe salesmen.
There were bartenders, there were students. It was a wild array of all kinds of people.
I'd only known Brooklynites or Manhattanites. Now suddenly I was thrown in to another world. I was intrigued by this world, by the way. And we were looked on as kind of nutcases by the hardworking, no-nonsense, backbone of America, the people who worked for a living and didn't sketch. We were looked upon as slightly freakish, I felt. And I think we probably were.
In early 1944, these camouflage artists were selected to be part of the Ghost Army. Instead of trying to hide things, they were now going to be in the risky business of drawing attention to themselves.
At which point somebody said, "You mean we're asking for the enemy to fire on us?" The answer was yes. At that point, we all came to the conclusion that this was a suicide outfit.
Their new assignment was to use decoy tanks and artillery to conjure up make-believe battalions. The concept was so out of the box that the Army had no book for them to go by, and at first, no decoys to work with. They improvised, fabricating dummy tanks out of wood and canvas and teaching themselves to be deceivers. Meantime, in the California desert, the Army was testing different kinds of decoys for possible Ghost Army use. One type consisted of a collapsible metal frame covered in fabric. When mounted on a Jeep, it could become a mobile decoy. Despite this advantage, the frames proved heavy, difficult to set up, and prone to breakage. The Army decided instead to go with inflatable dummies made out of rubber.
There was a little bundle of stuff which a tank was in, all compressed before you opened the bundle, spread the nozzles around, and inflated it.
Pulling this amorphic shape out of it, and then watching it being filled with air and taking form, you know, like a monster.
If things went very well, there were air compressors. If things went not so well, there were bicycle pumps. And if things went terribly badly, there were our lungs.
In most cases, like a German tank, we could have it inflated and moved within 15 or 20 minutes.
The artillery piece was good. The Jeep was good. But that M4 tank, that was the beauty. That was a piece of work, it really was.
Although they didn't see much use, there were also inflatable soldiers.
I didn't care for the personnel. They had some inflatable people, so-so.
I never saw that. I'm sorry I missed that. That would have really made me laugh.
As the camoufleurs came to grips with their strange new job, another unit picked for the Ghost Army was learning about a brand new kind of warfare: sonic warfare.
I was interviewed for a top secret organization, which was involved in psychological warfare and something to do with sound. I thought sound, we were going to zap all the Germans within the war, and that would be it. But it was more psychology than zapping.
Using sound to fool the enemy was a new idea in World War II, made possible by technology that didn't exist a few years earlier. The Army set up its sonic warfare program under another officer who had been a prominent personality before the war, Hilton Howell Rayleigh.
He was the father of the whole sonic project. He had been a newspaper man, then he became a military man.
Most notably, Rayleigh was the PR man who recruited Amelia Earhart to become the first woman to fly the Atlantic, launching her to international fame.
I can remember so well his greeting to me was that, "Lieutenant," he said, "the mission of your company will be to draw enemy fire." I suggested that as a kid from the Bronx, I said, you know, I certainly respect the role that we have to play, but I reserve the right to kick a little ass myself if I get the opportunity. And he roared.
In early 1944, Rayleigh sent a team with a portable audio studio down to the Army Proving Ground at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Working with experts from Bell Labs, they spent 3 weeks recording sounds onto 16-inch transcription discs, the same kind used to make hit records.
The recordings were brilliant. I mean, if there was a road leading up, the music had to be described. The change of gears, tanks going up, tanks going down, tanks assembling.
And then we'd go to another spot where trucks were just flying through on the highway.
They had the recordings of building a pontoon bridge or any type of bridge, and you could hear them hammering away and swearing. And
different sounds could then be queued up on different turntables and mixed together to create whatever scenario was required. One of the earliest known uses of multi-track recording.
And this is all recorded on a wire. Remember, back there was no tape.
The wire recorder was advanced technology in the 1940s. A single spool contained 2 miles of magnetized wire, enough for 30 minutes of sound. And unlike a record, it was never going to skip. The recordings were played over 500-pound speakers with a range of 15 miles.
Back of my half-track, I tell my children, was the biggest boombox you ever saw, but it played sounds of tanks and activity.
Sonic deception was so new that Colonel Rayleigh made a top-secret film to explain its novel purpose to high-ranking Army officers. The film illustrated how a few carefully positioned sound trucks could simulate the movement of an armored division at night in order to draw the enemy's attention away from the real division.
Siegfried Dorr, Elbe Prime speaking. Please, what?
In the training film, the Germans are comically bewildered when American tanks show up where they aren't expected.
Did you say tanks? What's all this nonsense about tanks?
Hold them. With what? Bayonets?
But no one knew if sonic warfare could really work. Rounding out the corps of deceivers were the radio operators of the signal company Special.
Now, when you think of the 23rd Special Troops, you think of the inflatable tank or the sound guys, and they're great. But they have to have a stage on which to perform. And we provided that stage.
By some estimates, German Army units gathered as much as 75% of their intelligence from radio intercepts. Convincing radio transmissions could attract enemy attention the way a red flag attracts a bull.
The British had captured an entire German radio interception unit, and they were able to see that the Germans could very precisely pinpoint Allied units from their radio transmissions, and they were actually quite stunned at how good the Germans were at this.
To fool the Germans, more than 100 skilled radio operators were plucked from units around the country. Stan Nance was on desert maneuvers with the 11th Armored when a stranger in a Jeep came looking for him.
He said, "Get your equipment and come with me." And I just said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "All I can tell you is that I'm not supposed to tell you and for you to shut up."
Lieutenant Bob Conrad, a signal officer for the Dixie Division, was another who found himself suddenly transferred to a mysterious new unit.
I had no idea of why I was there or what I was to be doing. After I was there for a few days, I spoke to this major, and I said, "What is this organization?" And he said, "Let's put it this way, Lieutenant. If we are totally successful, you may not come back."
Their mission was to replicate the radio transmissions of the units they were impersonating.
It's an art of knowing just how many and what type of messages to send. And this is one of the things that the 23rd did was it studied its own Army's transmissions, so they knew if they were simulating an infantry regiment moving across an area, how many times a day would the regiments send messages to battalion? Would battalions send messages to regiments?
We painted a picture in the German intelligence as what was going on.
These three distinct units, the 603rd with its dummy tanks, the Sonic Company with its audio equipment, and the Signal Company with its radios, became the deception core of the Ghost Army. In May 1944, they headed for Europe, filled with excitement and uncertainty.
You couldn't really believe that what we were going to do would be effective. How could we come along with rubber dummies and blow it up and make it look real?
None of us took it that seriously. We did what we were supposed to do, but we didn't really believe the big picture until we got fired at and shot when reality struck.
Allied naval forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
A week after the invasion of D-Day, I was with this nice girl, and I remember thinking, what in the hell am I doing in the British countryside with a pretty girl when there are guys my age being shot at and killed in Normandy? And I remember kissing her goodnight and riding my bike back to our tent, and there was a light on in our tent. And somebody said, "Who's there?" And I said, "Sergeant Dowd." And a voice said, "You'd better get in here." And I said, "Well, let me park my bike." And one of the wise guy members of the platoon said, "You're not going to need your bike anymore." The next day, we were on Omaha Beach in Normandy.
Surprise orders had come down for a 15-man platoon to head to Normandy with dummy artillery ahead of the rest of the Ghost Army. The time had come to see whether they could really fool the Germans and survive.
Before we knew it, we were on this C-47, landed on a metal mesh landing strip on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 14th, which was 8 days after D-Day.
The platoon was under the command of Lieutenant Bernie Mason.
My assignment was to report to the commander of the 980th Artillery Battalion, and our objective was to set up dummy artillery emplacements about a mile ahead of his actual position to try to draw the enemy's fire into our position and have his not touched.
Victor Dowd was a sergeant in Mason's platoon.
And I can remember the wild difference between last night when I was in the lovely, quiet, serene countryside and the grim reality of today, where I could still hear machine gun fire. So the fighting was within earshot, certainly, and there were dead German soldiers all over the ground. I did a sketch of a German helmet and a potato masher hand grenade. So this, to me, symbolized war.
Task Force Mason worked with the 980th Artillery for 28 days. Their deception proved successful. They tricked the Germans into shelling their phony guns, but managed to avoid suffering any casualties. Two weeks after D-Day, the rest of the Ghost Army, minus the Sonic Company still training in England, packed its gear and shipped out for France.
When we got on the boat, there was nothing to do. June 23rd, and the title was Waiting. June 24th, the title was Waiting. Then I have pictures of all the soldiers aboard waiting. And then all of a sudden a picture shows up and says, "On our way."
We were anchored off of Normandy, and we were going to disembark. And we were loaded down with everything, rifles, ammunition, helmets, and so forth. We were waiting for our names to be called so we would go over the side on the cargo nets into the landing boats onto the beach. And I looked out and I saw this incredible scene. I mean, something that I felt I would never, ever see again in my life. This was really history in the making. So I did this sketch, which is very rough, but it gives you an idea of what it looked like, with the barrage balloons and every imaginable kind of ship as far as you could see.
Once ashore in Normandy, the men set up their dummies to make sure everything was in working order.
I was on guard duty, and two Frenchmen on bicycles got through the perimeter. And I halted them, and they weren't looking at me. They were looking at something over my shoulder. And what they thought they saw was 4 GIs picking up what was a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. They looked at me, and then they looked at the situation. They were looking for answers. And I finally said, "The Americans are very strong."
In July and August, the Ghost Army conducted its first large-scale deceptions, using visual and radio only. With each performance, they learned how to make themselves more convincing.
At every level, the art of war requires intelligent and creative thought, and probably no more so than in the practice of deception, because there you have to see into the mind of your adversary, and you have to create for him a misleading picture of the operation to come, and you have to sell it to him with confidence. It's the highest kind of creativity in the art of war.
Deception demanded an artist's eye for detail.
We could position certain things so that they would be hidden, but kind of hidden in plain sight, so that if reconnaissance planes came over, maybe they would just see the corner of something sticking out, and they know if they can see 1 or 2 sticking out, there must be more that they can't.
We wanted to create the natural debris that goes with faking something.
A company of Ghost Army combat engineers used bulldozers to create phony tank tracks.
We did similar things with artillery. You lay phony artillery shells around and make it look as if they had been firing.
Moving through the French villages so recently occupied by the Germans, they saw an opportunity to improvise yet another way to sell their deceptions, targeting enemy spies that might have stayed behind. They called it special effects.
Why don't we put a stencil of the name of the unit that we were simulating right on the trucks? And why don't we start a counterfeit shoulder patch factory where they would see we were the 75th Division, one of the divisions we did?
Sometimes they used actual patches from the unit they were impersonating. Other times, they had to hand paint their own knockoffs.
So we began to put on their patches and put their bumper markings on, and we physically assumed the role. Only for every 100 of them, there might be 10 of us.
We had a sewing kit. That's one of the things that was required that we carry with us all the time.
Give us the patches, and we were good at sewing them on. Seamstresses.
My shirts were all wrecked from having sewn so many different shoulder patches on them.
They even set up phony command posts, and against all Army regulations, staffed them with counterfeit commanders.
If you're going to bring a division up, you better have a headquarters somewhere, and there better be a major general walking around. And so we had to have a full general do this. Some sergeant would wear 2 stars for an operation.
Our job was to go in with our phony markings and phony stories that we were pretending to be officers and soldiers from another organization. And we were turned loose in town. Go to the pub, order some omelets, and talk loose.
And a lot of the guys went to the bakery, got rolls and stuff, and said, we got to get an extra supply because we're moving out tonight, that kind of thing.
It was almost kind of silly, really. But I think what really confirmed the fact that there was effectiveness was sitting in a cafe and seeing a door open up gradually and somebody was taking pictures.
We'd find out if like a division or a special unit had a particular song that they liked to sing. You know, we get blitzed and then sing their song.
As the Ghost Army made its way through France, the artists in the 603rd broke out their sketchbooks.
To be in the middle of this incredible adventure with the world at war in a foreign country, I just had to put it down.
Any given opportunity, the guys would draw. Guys would draw with a fountain pen and spit. You make the drawing and then you wet it and it makes nice halftones in there.
A few miles from the Ghost Army's first bivouac was the Normandy village of Trevière. The artists were drawn to a bombed-out church off the town square.
These were some of the first sketches I did. They were not too long after the invasion. In the remains of this church, we might have had 3 or 4 guys in there sketching. We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor.
I was not the only soldier with a sketchbook. I'd have sketched whether I was the only soldier or not, but to be quite honest with you, I think it helped keep me in balance. I think it kept my sanity.
In mid-August, Allied armies broke out of Normandy and raced across France. The Ghost Army was on the move as well. Their destination was the port city of Brest, under siege by the Allies, but still tenaciously held by the Germans.
Brest was a hard nut to crack. It was a seaport that the Germans wanted to defend, and we wanted it because we needed a port.
The Sonic unit had just arrived in Europe, so Operation Brest became the Ghost Army's first chance to use all its means of deception at the same time. Their mission was to inflate the apparent size of the American forces attacking Brest by impersonating the 6th Armored Division. They sought to draw German reserves to the flanks, clearing the way for an attack in the center. Sound trucks pulled to within a few hundred yards of German lines.
Crank the speakers up out of the back of the half-track and play a program to the enemy all night of us bringing equipment into the scene. We could make them believe that we were coming in with an armored division.
They painted 6th Armored markings on their trucks and drove them back and forth through nearby towns.
We did a lot of ride through with two guys in the back of a truck to make it look like it was full.
Radio operators mimicked a tank battalion coming into the line. More than 50 dummy tanks were set up, along with dummy artillery. They were so close to the front that shells frequently screamed down around them.
And we could see the church tower where they were observing us. And of course, you had to tend these dummies all the time. And during the night, the gun turrets would sag, and that's a bad visual effect the next morning if the Germans are looking down there and seeing sagging gun barrels.
To see a gun like that would be quite a giveaway. We didn't have any guns that shot into the ground like that.
Captured German officers revealed to interrogators that they were convinced the 6th Armored was really there. But in the minds of many veterans, that success was overshadowed by the deadly consequences of an American attack mistakenly launched right where the Ghost Army was attracting German attention.
We did a very successful sonic imitation of the assembling of tanks, and for some reason or other, the commanding officer of this tank battalion sends his tanks right down the ravine that we had played for dummies' sake.
German anti-tank weapons drawn by the deception opened fire on the American tanks.
Those guys never reached the line of departure, which is the point that they want to start their attack from. They never even got that far. They got decimated. We had no way of knowing they were going to kick off an attack. And they had no way of knowing that we weren't going to help them. You know, and it makes you feel lousy.
On August 25, 1944, the city of Paris was liberated from more than 4 years of German occupation. Parisians were still celebrating as the Ghost Army pulled into a nearby town to await their next operation. For one wonderful week, they would savor the pleasures of a Paris still giddy with euphoria. Paris was put off limits and on limits so often, recalled one Ghost Army officer, that everyone, in confusion, visited it whenever possible. It was a great town. The girls looked like delightful dolls, especially when they whizzed past on bicycles with billowing skirts. The Parisians were very happy to see us.
And we got in every night and came back pretty drunk, and then started the next day, and then the next night in Paris, and so forth.
We went to a cafe, which was a brothel, and the ladies would be downstairs in their scanty costumes, and again, it was a great opportunity for me to draw. I'm not Toulouse-Lautrec, but here were these women in their underwear. A woman named Doris sat on my table. She had a glass of wine in her hand and a cigarette in the other hand, high heels and practically no clothes on. And she was trying to entice me to go upstairs. And I wouldn't have had to pay anything if I gave her the drawing. But I wasn't particularly anxious to go upstairs with Doris, and I decided to keep the drawing.
All too soon, the pleasant interlude in Paris came to an abrupt halt. The Ghost Army was ordered to make a mad dash across France, to lend a hand to General George Patton's Third Army. In Patton's haste to capture the fortress city of Metz near the German border, a yawning gap had opened up to the north.
If the Germans realized that there were effectively no troops in the 70-mile wide stretch, they could have broken through easily, and if they could have gotten some of their mechanized units there, they could have surrounded Patton at Metz to the south. This was a very, very severe risk.
In other words, there was nothing between the German army and Paris but a bunch of rubber tanks.
German troops were incredibly close, just across the Moselle River, making sonic deception particularly crucial. Sonic trucks operated for 4 straight nights.
Enormous sounds of tracks racing through the forest sounded like a whole division was amassing. Sergeants' voices yelling, "Put out that goddamn cigarette now!" And it was all fakery. It was all a big act.
After a while, my eyes were beginning to tell me what my ears were hearing, and I began to see tanks. They weren't there. They were in my ear, but they weren't.
The Ghost Army held the position day after perilous day, aware that every passing hour increased the odds that the Germans might see through their deception.
And there was nothing between us but our hopes and prayers that separated us from the Panzer Division.
Even Patton himself was feeling the pressure. "There is one rather bad spot in my line," he wrote to his wife, "but I don't think the Huns know it. Holding it now by the grace of God and a lot of guts." After 7 days of high-stakes play acting, the U.S. 83rd Division arrived to fill the hole for real. Patton's line had held, and the Ghost Army faded away. In September, the Ghost Army relocated to Luxembourg City. For the next 3 months, it served as their base for deception missions up and down the front.
So if we went out on missions, we came back to Luxembourg, and we were in an old seminary building, and we were living pretty good. And the town was not destroyed, and it even had art supply stores.
Between missions, some of the artists in the unit sought to capture the beauty of Luxembourg's old city. John Jarvie looked elsewhere for inspiration.
These are pictures of the local whorehouse. It was a busy place, I'll tell you. And we went down there to sketch. But we also had a combat engineer unit in our outfit, the 23rd. And they thought we were queer. They said, "What are you doing here sketching pictures?" And they were busy waiting their turn and fighting for turn. And here's one guy who was propositioning the madam who ran the place, but he couldn't afford her. But the girls were just making a living. When they left at night, their husbands would wait outside the door for them and take them home.
Another artist constantly sketching was a 21-year-old from Indiana named Bill Blass.
Bill Blass, great guy, wonderful, knew what he wanted, read Vogue in his foxhole. The rest of us were a bunch of slobs, but not Blass. He was always dressed to the nines. We all had the same uniforms, but leave it to Blass to have his pressed or something.
Blass filled his notebooks with ideas for women's clothing, even sketching a logo he wanted to use for his fashion designs after the war.
Those of us from New York, thought we were very sophisticated. But Bill, of course, came from Fort Wayne, Indiana. and he was far more sophisticated than most of us.
He was charming, and he was genuine, and he was eager, and he was attractive. It was the whole thing, you know, was a package.
In December 1944, the Ghost Army headed out on what seemed like just another mission, their 6th since arriving in Luxembourg. Heavy fighting was taking place near the German city of Cologne, but further south, a 90-mile section of the front along the rugged Ardennes forest was thinly held by just 4 American divisions.
The Army, in its wisdom, decided they would send the wonderful 23rd Headquarters up there to create the illusion that there were more troops than they were. And we went in representing the 75th Infantry Division, which was still in England, as I recall.
But the sector wasn't nearly as quiet as it seemed, and the Ghost Army was about to get caught up in one of the biggest battles of the Second World War.
The Germans were coming in, getting ready for the Bulge. They were putting all their heavy hitters in there, and we didn't know it.
In the early morning hours of December 16th, Hitler's legions unleashed a massive surprise attack in a last-ditch attempt to win the war. Dazed American units along the front barely knew what hit them.
Suddenly, out of the snow and out of the darkness, a group of men in white uniforms are moving towards you, and you're thinking, well, what is that? And they're 300 yards, they're 200 yards, and suddenly you realize that's the enemy, and it's almost too late.
The attack would become famous as the Battle of the Bulge.
If you look at where the Germans attacked, they attacked smack into the 23rd Special Troops.
The fortunate thing was that on the evening of December 15th, came midnight, and somebody in their wisdom decided to pull us out. So we left at midnight, December 16th, and the Battle of the Bulge started about 4 a.m. December 16th, just shortly after we left. And if we'd have been there, there'd be no 23rd.
Many were not immediately aware of their close call. Spike Berry didn't hear about the attack until he made a routine run to a nearby town to return a movie shown to some of the men the night before.
And I went into this town where 8th Corps was. Film library was closed, gone, nobody there. I went to the middle of the town, a little square, and there was an MP there. And I said, "What's going on here?" He said, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm returning a movie film." He said, "You're returning what?" I said, "I'm returning a movie film." He said, "Listen, sir," he said, "you get that Thompson submachine gun that's in your leather holster along your spare tire, and then you and your driver get the hell out of town." And so we left Bastogne.
Bastogne was surrounded shortly afterwards, earning a place in history for the stand made there by the 101st Airborne. Back in Luxembourg City, less than 20 miles from the attacking Germans, Ghost Army gunners manned rooftop machine guns and blazed away at attacking Luftwaffe planes. It was the only time during the war they actually had a chance to fire at the enemy.
I was given the order to set charges on all our vehicles so that in case the enemy overran Luxembourg, we would destroy it. So that was kind of scary.
Victory looks like it's in sight. The Allies are pushing like crazy. Then, whammo, out of nowhere. "Pack up, we're going, the Germans are coming." I said, "What do you mean the Germans are coming? Isn't the war over?" "No, we gotta go, we're leaving. You have an hour to get all your stuff together, we're getting out of here. Trucks are waiting in front of this building. We're retreating." We said, "Retreating? We're supposed to have won this war, or on the verge of winning it." I remember it was a very depressing moment. What's happened? Where did these Germans get this suddenly 11th hour energy from?
The Army didn't want to risk blowing the cover of the deceivers, so they were hustled to the rear.
When this hit, they certainly didn't want rubber tanks. They wanted the real thing. So we pulled out
we didn't really stop. We kept going. And it was snowing. You can't believe how it was snowing.
When we got into Luxembourg, there were lots of American flags flying. As we're leaving Luxembourg, there's swastikas flying. This is in no way meant to indict the Luxembourg people, but it said something about Europe. They were victim to these hordes coming in all directions, and they had to be prepared to survive.
At that point, our lives changed radically, and the 23rd was pulled back and sent to Verdun, which still smelled of World War I.
Verdun was the site of one of the biggest battles of World War I. More than 500,000 soldiers died there. It was in the cold and damp World War I fortifications that the Ghost Army camped out at Christmas time.
So here I am on guard duty, and I had my pen and ink with me, and drawing in the dark practically. And I just had to record that site.
Another Ghost Army soldier, Arthur Singer, captured the same scene.
It brought up the whole issue that war is about life and death, and we were right in the middle of it.
Now it's Christmas time, what do you do next? Well, one of the guys went out and cut a Christmas tree and rigged it inside the pillbox. And then the question, how do you decorate it? Well, one way was to inflate condoms and hang them on there like balloons. And the other method was to take tin cans and cut stars out of the tin cans. And we hung on the trees, and that was our Christmas tree.
There were Polish refugees and other Middle European refugee children. And being American soldiers, we tried to enliven their lives by giving them presents and so forth. And I did indeed do a drawing of a little boy. I can remember it so vividly. He had this box, and it was open, but he was so forlorn looking, and nobody could get this little boy to smile. God knows what he'd been through.
And that was Christmas in 1944.
By January 1945, the German attack had been blunted, and the Allies were back on the offensive. The Ghost Army was called on to conduct a series of deceptions to mask where each new blow would fall. Suddenly, they were busier than ever. They ranged across parts of Luxembourg, Belgium, France, and Germany.
Man, we used a lot of fuel. And we traveled more across Europe than I'm sure any other Army unit.
There were days it seemed that we didn't get any sleep.
It was all happening in the harshest of conditions.
On the ground, in snow, without a tent.
They said it was the coldest winter in 40 years in France, and I believe them. It was misery.
After sleeping in the ground for many months, I would have just loved to have gotten up in one of those tanks, those soft tanks, and gone to sleep. Of course, that would be a court-martial offense.
For months, the men of the Ghost Army had led a charmed life, often drawing fire, but taking virtually no casualties. On March 12, 1945, the odds finally caught up with them. They were impersonating the 80th Infantry Division, and sobering proof that their deception worked came in the form of deadly German artillery fire.
And there were people probably no more than 20, 30 feet away from me that lost limbs because of shrapnel just falling all over.
And I remember sitting in the truck with my truck driver and a bunch of guys in the back of the truck, and a shell landed in front of us, and then a shell flew over our heads and hit the truck behind us. And I was thinking, do I tell him to get the hell out of here now? And with that, the signal came and we moved. And it was just a case of luck. Luck is the paramount word. If you're in the wrong place, you can be dead. If you're in the right place, you can live to be as old as I am.
2 men were killed, 15 wounded in the Ghost Army's deadliest day. Just 2 weeks later, the men of the Ghost Army set out on what was to be their last and most critical mission of the war.
The Rhine River is the western boundary of the most important industrial heartland of Germany. It's the most direct route to Berlin. So the heat was on, and the idea was how to get across the Rhine River.
The 21st Army Group under British General Bernard Law Montgomery was picked to make the major thrust across the Rhine. 2 divisions of the American 9th Army, the 30th and the 79th, would lead one wing of the attack. The job of the Ghost Army was to fool the Germans into thinking that those 2 divisions were actually going to attack 10 miles to the south. To pull it off, they would have to operate on a bigger scale than ever before, with thousands of lives at risk. Operation Viersen would require 1,100 men to convince the Germans that they were 30,000.
We moved on up into this last grand deception.
Hundreds of decoys were set up around the towns of Anrath and Dulken. Real armored vehicles and infantry were used to enhance the illusion. Enclosed farmyards were turned into phony repair depots. A forest was converted into a decoy motor pool.
We even had dummy L5s, small observation planes that were inflatable, and we created an airstrip. So from the air, it would look like an active unit complete with its air observation components.
So convincing were the phony airfields that a real observation plane mistakenly landed at one and was promptly told to get lost. As the real divisions were moving in, their radio operators went off the air at a pre-assigned moment. Ghost Army radio operators began imitating them, creating the illusion that the troops were traveling to the fake point of attack.
German intelligence, radio monitoring, and traffic, which thought they could identify the signal of an individual telegrapher, missed it. These guys were that good.
At night, the sonic trucks played the sounds of soldiers assembling the pontoon bridges needed to span the Rhine.
Created this effect of all this preparation for a crossing of the river at that point.
On the eve of the Rhine crossing, Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill joined General Montgomery to witness the momentous occasion. Tremendous efforts had gone into the deception, but no one knew whether they would really work. In the early morning hours of March 24th, Navy landing craft began crossing the Rhine. Infantrymen on board steeled themselves for fierce fighting. What they found, however, was weak and disorganized resistance, as if the Germans were expecting the attack someplace else.
The 9th U.S. Army gets across with so few casualties, they would almost have that many casualties if they were running a big training exercise.
U.S. Army intelligence officers were convinced that the deception was a rousing success. Captured German maps showed the 79th Division right where the Ghost Army portrayed it. There is no doubt, said one report, that Operation Viersen materially assisted in deceiving the enemy with regard to the real dispositions and intentions of this army.
You go up against the best army there is and the best group of soldiers, and you can dupe them successfully, you pat yourself on the back.
In some people's minds, probably justifies the existence of the whole unit. And it's pretty impressive.
One of those impressed was the commander of the U.S. Ninth Army, General William Simpson. He wrote a letter of commendation calling the deception an important part of the operation, adding that it reflected great credit on this unit. A glowing review for the final performance of the Ghost Army.
The day I got out of the Army, I think, was the happiest day of my life. It wasn't the day that I got married or when my first son was born or anything else. It was when I got out of the Army.
After the war, Arthur Shillstone became an illustrator, working for dozens of magazines. He was one of many Ghost Army artists who went on to successful art careers. Jack Macy was another.
I learned a lot fooling people and deceiving people, and it stood me in very good stead for the rest of my life.
Macy designed exhibits for the U.S. government, including the 1959 Moscow exhibition that was the site of the famous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon. A surprising number of Ghost Army soldiers won fame as artists and designers. Bill Blass became a fashion superstar. Ellsworth Kelly, a celebrated minimalist painter. Arthur Singer's bird illustrations earned him world renown. Art Kane's photograph of 57 musicians on a stoop in Harlem remains a jazz icon. Many others made their mark as designers, illustrators, painters, sculptors, and architects. The official Army history of the unit and the details of its wartime operations were kept under wraps for more than 40 years.
We were told we couldn't tell our wives or anybody about what we did. It was totally secret.
Americans were pretty convinced the next war was going to be against the Russians. And so when you have operations that work well against the Germans, you don't want to tell the Russians what you did, because then they'll be prepared for them and it will be useless against them. And that's one of the reasons why it stayed secret for so long, because during the Cold War, it was something that we didn't want the Russians to know.
The Ghost Army never launched an attack, never took a position. Their victories were of a different sort.
Did it absolutely baffle the Germans every time? Probably not. Did it cause the Germans to react in ways that we wanted them to react? Definitely.
There are German records that show that some of the deceptions were taken hook, line, and sinker. The 23rd did not win the war single-handedly, but I think it would have cost a lot more American casualties had they not been there.
You know you saved lives, you don't know how many you saved, but you know you saved them.
They estimated that we saved between 15 and 30,000 lives with our maneuvers. But you know, even if we'd only saved 15 or 30, it was worth it.
One mother or one new bride was spared the agony of putting a gold star in their front window. That's what the 23rd headquarters was all about.
The story of the Ghost Army is one of creativity flourishing under the most extreme circumstances. Their best art was not the paintings and drawings they left behind, but the ephemeral masterpieces they created on the battlefield.
Can you picture the German commander after he was preparing to defend himself and perhaps attack over in our direction, going over there and finding nothing? maybe a lot of tank tracks, because we were gone. That's the Ghost Army.